Hello, my name is Ilva Tare. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome to Balkans Debrief, our new interview series on recent development in the region. Identity conflicts have, perhaps unfairly, long been synonymous with the Western Balkans. Disputes over national identity have, after all, shaped European history more broadly. Nevertheless, one dramatic identity conflict is playing out today between Bulgaria and North Macedonia, with the latter country's EU accession prospects in question as a result. Today we are joined by Dimitar Bechev, lecturer at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Dimitar, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let us start with an easy question for a very complicated conflict. What is this dispute about?
Yeah, it's a long story, but essentially it boils down to what it means to be Macedonian and how the Macedonian nation, as we know it, and its language came about. For the Macedonians, it's been a fact for centuries. For Bulgarians, it's a recent artifact dating back to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And this conflict has been raging on and off since the early 1960s. So that's the short answer. The long answer is in my historical dictionary of the North Macedonia, which is there at all good bookshops.
I think we can go later on further on to the arguments on both sides, but I wanted to ask you about Francis Emmanuel Macron proposing a solution to the conflict ahead of the EU Council meeting and Western Balkan Summit, which Bulgaria accepted. Is it, in your opinion, a good compromise? Is it balanced?
Well, you know what Churchill said about democracy. Democracy is the worst system except for other systems. So the same can be said about this proposal. It's probably not a good proposal in and of itself, but it's the best we have right now. And this is where I differ from many people, including colleagues and friends in North Macedonia. It's just a pragmatic way to shut down the dispute for the time being and move forward with the negotiations. And I think that's what's going to happen.
Well, protests have broken out in North Macedonia, as I'm sure you have seen, after the government agreed to consider the French proposal. What are the chances that the 60 votes will be found in the Macedonian parliament?
Seems to me that they'll be able to marshal the votes, despite the threat of defection from various individual MPs or coalition partners. The difficult nut to crack will be later in the game, because part of the whole compromise is that North Macedonia would amend its constitution, which of course requires a two-third majority. And last time we were there in early 2019 over Prespa, it took quite a bit of political skill and maneuvering and jockeying to secure the opposition votes. Now, it's not very clear to me, if at all, that Christian Mickoski will be actually accepting that, because the thing is that he smells blood and thinks that it's a very opportune way to undermine the government and provoke early elections, which might see a turn at the helm in North Macedonia, with Vumero Dukmane coming to the fore. So there'll be protracted political crisis over the implementation, but at least for the time being, the negotiations can kick off, which, let's not forget, is important for Albania as well, not just for North Macedonia.
And what if the government falls due to public pressure and protests?
Yeah, I mean, it's very likely there will be a technical government, because this is the unspoken constitutional tradition established in Macedonia. That is a bipartisan administration, with ministers from the both main parties to oversee the elections, and we'll be in for protracted political crisis, maybe early elections, and in the meantime, the EU accession process will be not going anywhere. But I'm still cautious optimist, given the dynamics in Skopje, that the government will survive and they will adopt the compromise.
I'm sure you know the sentiment in North Macedonia is that they already have paid a high price for the EU integration, accession talks. Why should they be the ones to still sacrifice from their own identity? Do you think they're right on their assessment?
I mean, I can understand the argument, and if I was Macedonian, I'll be upset as well. But I mean, on its face, the compromise doesn't mean that it will wipe out Macedonian identity. I mean, if identity would be put aside or transformed by any juridical document, it's a very feeble identity, and nobody changed their mind about history after Prespa. Nobody will do so. At least very few people after this compromise. Even if there was political will in Skopje to change history books, it will take another decade at best. So I'm not as concerned. The thing is that it's again frustrating, since North Macedonia was originally judged to be in good shape to start negotiations in 2009. And here we are 13 years later, going in circles. That's number one. To me, also, the problem is that this whole tussle around identity and history obscures the fact that society's agenda is elsewhere. It's to do with the economy and also with good governance. And for that reason, negotiations are really important. I mean, we have to be realistic. It's not that North Macedonia will be a different place the day after the EU decides to open the negotiations. In fact, lots of the structural persistent issues will be still there. But in the EU perspective, is a necessary rather than a sufficient condition. They need this signal to get things in the right direction.
And Bulgaria knows that too. If the accession talks start with North Macedonia and Albania, nothing dramatically will change immediately. Could they have kept this issue on a bilateral level rather than put it as a precondition before starting accession talks with the EU?
Well, it depends who is they, because Bulgaria changed government several times in the meantime. So in 2019, when the regional veto was put forward, it was Borisov's government in place in coalition with the far right. So the people who run Bulgaria now inherited the veto, and they didn't like it, but they had to find a way out of it. And therefore, the French proposal was the best they could hope for. We don't know if this government is surviving. We'll know on Friday. So what's happening in Skopje mirrors events in Sofia in a funny way. But I don't think right now...
What about the public perception in Bulgaria? What's the public perception?
There is
because
no
as
public
you say,
perception.
government goes and comes.
There's not, I mean, that's this disconnect. Right now, nobody in Bulgaria pays attention to what's going on in Skopje. And I don't think that will be the case even in the future. The government is hovering. I mean, it's struggling to survive. There are all questions: who will be the new prime minister? Are we in for another elections in September? This is what dominates the agenda. On top of it, we have day-to-day occurrences. So North Macedonia has never been anywhere close to what keeps people up at night. Even the party which is responsible for the veto, the far-right coalition partner of Borisov, at the time, a lot of people speculated, oh yeah, they're doing it in order to make it into parliament. But lo and behold, in the elections in 2021, they failed repeatedly to clear the 4% threshold. So that's the irony. Now, Bulgaria has taken a very hardline position and is getting its way, but it's not something that resonates with society at large, or if it does, and that's a parallel with Greece. That was absolutely the same with Prespa. If it does, it also it's only at the symbolic level. It's not a priority that will decide the election in Sofia.
So if there is political will, there is room to find a compromise to move forward.
Exactly. That's the line of Petkov's government, or maybe the future Vasilev government, because they're swapping places with the number two in the previous government. They needed to find a way out, an off-ramp, as Americans like to say. France offered such a compromise. The Bulgarians sort of found a parliamentary majority which absolved the government from taking this decision, because now it's a cross-party, cross-bench. solution, including by the people who are responsible for the veto in the first place. I mean, it was ironic that Edi Rama in Tirana was thanking his friend Boyko Borisov for securing the votes in Sofia, given that Borisov was the person taking the decision. So from their perspective, that's a way to diffuse it and to send the ball into Skopje's court, and that's not what they want to talk about or do anything about. And it's on Kovachevsky right now, right? And to be honest.
Dimitar, is it wise for the EU to become the guarantor of a bilateral dispute between an aspirant country and an existing member? Have there been precedents for this in the previous rounds of the enlargement?
Well, I know that in an ideal world, the EU has to be impartial and just help countries to resolve their differences or facilitate agreement, and also focus on issues that are core to the EU, basically the Copenhagen criteria. But we don't live in an ideal world, let's be realistic. Member states dictate the policy, and most other member states are not there to push back against it. That was the case with Greece. That's one thing that Bulgaria saw in the case of Prespa. And that was also the case with Croatia having to accommodate Slovenia to an extent. Maybe the technicalities were not the same. The bilateral dispute was not in the negotiation framework. But it's a fact of life, and there is no way around it. Now, I know there are quite a few proposals that you change the methodology, you have qualified majority voting. I mean, that would be super if it happens, but I'm really skeptical this is likely to happen. And finally, there is one misconception, and that's why the Macedonians lost time. They somehow believe that the big member states will lean on Bulgaria, and Bulgaria will just take a step back. But that's not happening. That's not realistic. And that's really cost Macedonia quite a bit in the process, I think.
I agree. We don't live in an ideal world, but we fight for it, or at least for what we believe. Is it possible that Bulgaria and North Macedonia could build a model for a non-provocative manifestation of national identity? According to an article that I saw you wrote for Carnegie, Berlin may be serving as a key intermediary.
I don't believe so. I mean, to be honest, that's a dispute that is not really trickling down to the level of interpersonal connections. It's at the macro level. That's one. It's not that the average Bulgarian meeting and average Macedonia will start fighting on it. On the contrary, we have a very dense political and, economic and societal relationship. That's number one. Secondly, in the past, you have precedents of politicians acknowledging what's known as shared history, all the way to the mid-2000s, or even 1998, when the then Prime Minister Lucio Georgievski and Ivan Kostov, who found after forging a compromise on the language issue, they went to Rome to pay respect to Saint Cyril's tomb, something that Zaev would also do and Kovachevsky as well. So there are ways to do it. It's just clear that making history the centerpiece of the relationship is counterproductive, because the way the process is designed, and I'm not talking about the EU, but let's look at the bilateral level. If it's about our position versus your position, it becomes a zero-sum dynamic. One side has to give ground, the other side has to gain something, and vice versa. And that's not a very productive way to move forward on national narratives. A more benign understanding of the process would have involved people who don't speak for the national position, but are critically minded historians, and also potentially scholars from outside those two countries. And there are a few who have actually made a contribution towards the study of this whole complex Macedonian issue over the decades.
So who can mediate this situation? Is Berlin
No, that's
candidate?
the point. I don't think anybody would mediate. There's no way around those two governments sitting down together. And right now in Sofia, so long as this cabinet holds to power, you have some pragmatically minded people who want to diffuse history and not talk about it at all. They want to talk about roads, infrastructural connections, investment, and so on and so forth. And I think that's the instinct of Kovachevsky as well. But also you have other players in both capitals. They're the spoilers, be it President Radev, be it the Macedonian opposition as well. So one critical question is if the people who currently run the show in North Macedonia and Bulgaria will survive politically. Secondly, if they do, how they shift the conversation to more kind of down-to-earth, non-zero-sum dynamic and don't talk about history. And manage the whole dispute, because frankly, there is no resolution. There is no way to solve it one way or the other. The best you can hope for is just to keep it under wraps and neutralize it and agree to disagree and move forward. Will Germany play this role? I really doubt it, because again, member states stick for other member states, especially on issues that they don't care about it. It's not that France or Germany or anybody else will do much on something that they don't understand. It's a very esoteric issue. You have to even explain it to people from outside the two countries. And the natural instinct is let's let them decide and then stick with Bulgaria. And that's what's happened with the French proposal.
But I do hope Berlin and other EU members, they still care about the enlargement in the Western Balkans and starting accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania and the other candidate countries.
Yeah, but that they do care. That's absolutely the case. And now they believe that there is a compromise which actually recognizes the Macedonian language and the whole Macedonian identity. Of course, that's not how many or the majority of Macedonians see it. They think it's a big compromise, but that's not how it looks in Berlin or Paris. And that's a historic chance for finally for not just North Macedonia, but also Albania to start the negotiations. They need to make the next step.
As you're saying, North Macedonia is being pressured to swallow a second massive identity compromise in less than a decade for European accession. Given how transformative EU membership has been for all countries that have made it, do you think is it worth?
I don't believe there will be any change of identity, because, that's the wrong reading of Prespa. Prespa involved changing the name, but also involved concessions by Greece. And that's something that Sofia doesn't understand, that Tsipras actually acknowledged there is something called the Macedonian language. And in fact, the Bulgarian dispute results from Prespa. And also Tsipras gave or recognized Macedonia's or North Macedonia's right to use the adjective Macedonian. So even if nationalists in Skopje believed that Prespa was the end of the world, it wasn't actually. It involved some gains. Now, if Bulgaria wants to do something smart, it has to think along the same lines as Greece. You want them to change their way of telling the history of the past, and believe me, there are quite a few lacunae and blind spots on both sides. But in order to make anybody or the level of political elite in Skopje to give ground on these bilateral issues, which will remain even after the beginning of the negotiations, you have to also be prepared to give back concessions. It takes two to tango. And that's the fundamental misunderstanding for Bulgaria. So if Macedonia wrongly believed that the big guys will beat Bulgaria into submission, the fallacy on the Bulgarian side is that somehow North Macedonia will accept lock, stock and barrel, whatever the Bulgarian narrative is about. That's not happening either. But there is an opening right now, and I hope that there'll be enough momentum to start the negotiations.
Is this dispute setting precedents, good and bad, for future rounds of enlargement in the region?
Well, I think already the Greek vetoes set the precedents. And now the Bulgarian precedent is more kind of at the level of technicality, in the sense that the negotiation framework references bilateral friendship agreement and the protocols under that agreement. So that's why a lot of political commentators and diplomats are worked up about it. But frankly, would be expected, even without this dispute, that Croatia will be taking the Serbian candidacy lightly. That they won't be using or tempted to use their veto, given that also Croatia suffered because of Slovenia, and Croatia has meddled into Bosnia. I mean, that's realpolitik, unfortunately. You're absolutely right. The way to soften this or to cushion it is to involve informal negotiations, and the main member states can do something. But I don't see any indications that they're prepared to do it. I mean, Heiko Maas in Germany tried to do something. It didn't go anywhere. France, in their book, they're doing their utmost, but frankly, they're not interested in enlargement. And the genie is out of the bottle, and there will be more of those issues. Let's not fool ourselves.
Dimitar, I know you said there are very complicated issues between Bulgaria and North Macedonia, and old also, and it's almost impossible to explain everything in less than 20 minutes. But can I understand a little bit the issue with the name? Why Bulgaria? Sofia insists that North Macedonia should be called the Republic of the North Macedonia.
Yeah, I think that's not an issue anymore. It's really technical because they wanted to. Part of geographic North Macedonia is in Bulgaria. So Pirin Macedonia is much North Macedonia as the Republic. And that was the concern, that if you accept North Macedonia, then it somehow implies territorial claims, which I think is stupid. That's not serious. I mean, much more important is how we build a common story about what happened in the 19th and the 20th century. How come a lot of national heroes that are venerated in North Macedonia actually had Bulgarian national identity? From a position or from the perspective of European history, that's not unprecedented. You have lots of such cases. It's hard to distinguish in the past the Dutch and the Flemish, despite all the differences, and all Lithuanians and Poles and Austrians and Germans, if you will, more recently. But Macedonia is a young nation, and in order to ensure its future, it needed to look back into the past. So for them, it was anathema. And the whole Yugoslav period and beyond, that there was Bulgarian identity. For Bulgarians, especially those taking a very nationalistic perspective, it's hard to understand why should people where Bulgarian identity was so common generations back would opt for another form of identification. But again, if national identity is not something that is fixed, it's not hard to grasp. Macedonia is not the same place that it was in the early 20th century. A lot happened in between. And it's only natural that now people have a different sentiment, different orientation. But we should be able to talk in a mature, level-headed way about those matters, rather than politicize and shout at each other. And unfortunately, this historical commission hasn't contributed to that.
Mm-hmm. How about the issue with the language? Sofia claims that it is a Western Bulgarian dialect based on the assumption that the Bulgarian language has been in continuous use since the time of the Saints Cyril and Methodius in the 19th century.
That's not really the claim. I mean, that's a bit of exaggeration.
So is it Old Bulgarian, Old Slavic? What's the issue there?
Well, the issue is Bulgaria. I think the official position is not that it's a dialect. They say it's a version of Bulgarian that was being codified in Yugoslavia. So this is essentially the same language, but in two different forms for political reasons. I mean, that's a really problematic version because, what is a language? It's a dialect with an army and a navy, right? As the famous saying is. The Macedonian language has existence of its own, has a literature of its own. It's pretty not that dissimilar from Bulgarian. We can get into a very technical conversation, what are the differences and what are the similarities. And it's mutually understandable, but it's a separate language. Now, the thing about the language is that in 1999, the two governments found a compromise where actually Bulgaria signs all documents in Macedonian language, and it calls it Macedonian language as under the constitution of the Republic of Macedonia / North Macedonia right now. Now, this means that Sofia is saying, we recognize you call this in your constitution Macedonian language, and that's totally okay. We don't think that's the case, but that's your sovereign right. And unlike some speculations in Skopje, what the compromise under the French presidency entails is that all other 26 member states will accept there will be Macedonian language, including Greece, by the way, under PRESPA. There will be EU documents in Macedonian and so forth. Bulgaria will have an opt-out. So as opposed to Bulgaria imposing its formula, diplomatic, political formula, agreed with the Macedonians in 1999, it won't be Europeanizing that. So the language is, interestingly, is not such an issue anymore. There is a way around it, and the French compromise sort of sorts it out. And that Bulgaria won't be recognizing anything, but they'll agree to disagree. The sticky point, it seems to me, is the historical commission and the fact that now the negotiation framework sort of references it. And the other sticky point is the change of constitution. I think that's politically more difficult to implement.
To conclude it on a more positive note, you are optimistic that a compromise can be found?
Well, yes and no. I think that there'll be the votes to adopt the French proposal amidst lots of opposition and demonstrations and so on and so forth. But implementation will be difficult because Macedonia, North Macedonia, as well as Albania, will start negotiations after the adoption of the proposal. But then the real negotiations won't start until constitution is amended to include Bulgarians as one of the communities. And there I expect lots of back and forth. Although, I mean, if you're Macedonian nationalist, actually you might like the idea that Bulgarians are in the constitution because it means that they're different from the majority Macedonians. But it's not how it's framed like that right now. And it's really important how political players in Skopje read the proposal and what they make of it. Right now, it seems to me that the opposition is dead bent on just toppling the government and getting into their place in Skopje.
Dimitar Bechev, thank you for talking to Balkans Debrief. You can also join our conversation by using Twitter @AC Europe and using the hashtag Balkans Debrief.